laws, rules, structure. Keiko clung to these concepts like a drowning woman to driftwood. If there were rules, there were consequences for breaking them. If there were consequences, there was protection. Maybe. The barracks assigned to the female prisoners was separate from the main camp, a concession to gender and privacy. It had 12 beds with thin mattresses, a wood stove for heat, windows with screens. Basic, sparse, but clean. Keiko had lived in worse conditions in the field hospital on Tinian. That first evening, a truck arrived carrying dinner. American soldiers unloaded metal trays and brought them to the barracks, setting them on a long table. The smell hit Keiko before she saw the food. Meat, grease, sweetness, abundance. Hamburgers, French fries, Coca-Cola in glass bottles beaded with condensation. Apple pie with ice cream melting into the crust. The 8 nurses stood frozen, staring at the trays as if they'd been presented with evidence of alien life. This was more food than any of them had seen in months, maybe years. More food than Japanese civilians were getting back home, certainly more than the soldiers in the field had received. This was food for special occasions, for celebrations, for excess. And it was dinner. Just dinner. A regular meal in an American POW camp. Reiko reached out with trembling fingers and picked up a hamburger. She held it like something precious, examining the sesame seed bun, the beef patty, the cheese, lettuce, tomato, pickles. "What is this?" she whispered. "American food," Sergeant Takahashi said quietly. She'd stayed to help with the first meal, to answer questions, to ease the transition. "It's called a hamburger. It's very common here. Try it." Reiko took a tiny bite. Her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, swallowed, then took another bite, and another. And then she was eating with desperate hunger, tears streaming down her face, making small sobbing sounds as she chewed. The other nurses followed suit, all except Keiko. She stood rigid, watching her companions devour American plenty, and felt her world fracture completely. If this was how America fed its prisoners, how did it feed its soldiers? How did it feed its civilians? What vast reservoir of resources did this country possess that it could afford such abundance for captive enemies? And if America had this much, what did that say about Japan's chances of victory? What did it say about everything they'd been told about American weakness, American desperation, American inevitable defeat? Keiko's hands moved on their own, picking up the Coca-Cola bottle. The glass was cold, wet with condensation. She opened it, heard the hiss of carbonation, and brought it to her lips. The first sip was a revelation. Sweet, fizzing, cold, overwhelming. It tasted like nothing she'd ever experienced, like liquid sugar and bubbles and something sharp underneath. It tasted like excess, like decadence, like a country that could afford to make something this frivolous and distribute it to prisoners. The bottle slipped from Keiko's fingers. It hit the floor and shattered, spraying brown liquid and glass shards across the wooden planks. The sound was shockingly loud in the sudden silence, and Keiko broke. She doubled over, hands clutching her stomach, and sobbed. Great gasping sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside her that she'd forgotten that place existed. She cried for the boys she'd watched die, for the lies she'd believed, for her own complicity in a war machine that had chewed up her country and spit out nothing but ash. She cried for the hamburger she couldn't eat because eating it would mean accepting that everything she'd believed was wrong, and she wasn't ready, would never be ready for that. Sergeant Takahashi knelt beside her, careful not to touch, just present. "It's okay," she said softly in Japanese. "It's okay to be confused. It's okay to grieve. You're allowed to feel this." "We were told you were monsters," Keiko gasped between sobs. "We were told you'd do horrible things. We were told surrender was worse than death. And you give us hamburgers, you give us Coca-Cola. What kind of monsters do that?" "No kind," Takahashi said gently. "Because we're not monsters. We're just people who were also lied to about you. The difference is, our lies didn't make us cruel. They just made us afraid." Keiko looked up at her through tears. "What were you told about us?" "That you were fanatics who'd fight to the last man, that you didn't value life, yours or anyone else's, that you were so brainwashed by your emperor that you couldn't think for yourselves, that capturing you would be impossible because you'd always choose death. Takahashi paused. Some of that was true. Some of you did choose death. But some of you chose life, chose uncertainty, chose to trust that maybe, just maybe, we weren't what you'd been told. That took more courage than dying. Around them, the other nurses had stopped eating. They sat in silence, holding their hamburgers and Coca-Colas, each lost in their own private reckoning with what this meal meant, what it revealed, what it destroyed. Michiko spoke first, her voice rough. My brother was at Guadalcanal. He died there. We received his ashes, though who knows if they were really his. Before he left, he made me promise that if I was ever captured, I'd kill myself rather than disgrace the family. I promised him, I swore. And now? Keiko asked. Keiko, now I'm eating a hamburger and I can't stop crying because it's delicious and I hate myself for thinking that. Michiko laughed, a sound like something breaking. I'm a traitor. We're all traitors. We surrendered. We're eating enemy food. We're alive when we should be dead. How do we live with that? No one had an answer. They finished their meals in silence, each bite an act of survival and betrayal, each swallow a choice to keep living in a world that no longer made sense. Part 4. The Rhythm of Captivity. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The POW camp developed its own rhythm, its own normalcy that felt surreal in its mundanity. Wake at dawn to the sound of a bugle. Breakfast that always came. Oatmeal, toast, sometimes bacon or eggs, coffee, orange juice. More food than they needed, always more than they needed. The abundance never stopped being startling. Work assignments were offered, not forced. The women could choose to help in the camp laundry, the kitchen, the garden that had been started behind their barracks. They were paid in camp scrip, fake money they could use at the commissary for toiletries, stationery, small luxuries. The concept of paying prisoners for work was bizarre, almost offensive. Prisoners were supposed to suffer, not earn wages. Keiko chose to work in the camp infirmary, helping the American medics with basic nursing tasks. It felt right to use her training, to do something useful. The head medic, Captain Robert Chen, was a Chinese-American doctor who'd been sent to the camp because, like Sergeant Takahashi, he looked Asian enough to make the white officers uncomfortable in combat zones, but was useful enough to keep around. They don't trust us to fight, Chen explained one day while they were restocking bandages, but they trust us to heal. Figure that one out. Do you resent it? Keiko asked. Every day, but I'm still saving lives, so it could be worse. He paused. My grandparents were killed in the Nanking massacre, Japanese soldiers. I should hate you probably, but you're just a nurse who got caught in the same machine that crushed my family. So what's the point of hate? Just makes more bodies. The camp had a small library, donated books in Japanese from universities and private collections. Keiko devoured them, starving for information, for context, for understanding. She read novels, poetry, histories. She read about the Geneva Convention, about international law, about the American concept of inalienable rights. She read about democracy, about checks and balances, about systems designed to prevent the concentration of absolute power. She read about what Japan had done in Asia, the rape of Nanking, comfort women, medical experiments, prisoner abuse that made American POW camps look like luxury hotels. She read testimonies, saw photographs, documentation that had been compiled by neutral observers and couldn't be dismissed as enemy propaganda. And she understood, with a sickness that settled into her bones, that her country had been the monster. Not exclusively, not uniquely, but undeniably. The righteous war she'd believed in had been conquest dressed up as liberation. The suffering she'd witnessed had been in service of atrocity. The hamburger moment, as she'd started thinking of it, had been the crack in the wall. But this was the wall crumbling completely, revealing the abyss behind it. She told no one what she was learning. The other nurses were coping in their own ways. Reiko had discovered American music and spent hours listening to the radio, learning English through song lyrics. Sachiko taught herself to make origami from scrap paper, creating beautiful cranes that she gave to the guards as gifts, small bridges between worlds. Michiko had withdrawn into silence, working in the garden with methodical intensity, her hands always busy, her face carefully blank, but they all felt it. The slow dissolution of certainty, the growing awareness that they were alive because America had chosen to let them live, not because they deserved it or had earned it, but because America's rules said prisoners were to be kept alive. The power in that, the fundamental inequality of it, was crushing. In October, the mail started coming. Red Cross letters, censored and delayed, but real. Connections to home, to families who'd been told they were dead. Keiko's mother wrote in shaky handwriting, "They said you died at Tinian. They held a funeral. We mourned. How can you be alive? What does this mean? Are you truly my daughter, or is this American trickery?" Her mother didn't understand. Couldn't understand. The gap between what people in Japan believed and what Keiko was living was too vast to bridge in a letter that would be read by censors on both sides. Keiko wrote back carefully, "I am alive. I am being treated fairly. I am not tortured. I am not starving. I hope this brings you peace instead of shame. I did not choose to survive. I simply did not choose to die. Please forgive me." She didn't know if the letter would ever reach her mother. Didn't know if her mother would want it to. Part 5. The Weight of Kindness. The true cruelty of the camp wasn't cruelty at all. It was kindness. It was the daily grinding reality of being treated with basic human decency by people who had every reason to treat them harshly and every cultural excuse to do so. The guards learned their names, not prisoner or enemy, but Keiko, Reiko, Sachiko, Michiko. They made small talk, asked about their days, shared pictures of families back home. They were young men, mostly, farm boys and city kids who'd been drafted or enlisted, who saw this assignment as boring but preferable to combat. They didn't hate the Japanese prisoners. They barely thought about them as Japanese. They were just people who'd been captured, same as anyone. This casualness, this normalcy, was harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Cruelty could be resisted, survived, used to reinforce the belief in American monstrosity. But kindness from monsters meant they weren't monsters, which meant everything else collapsed. In December, Christmas came. The camp was decorated with paper snowflakes made by prisoners, pine branches gathered from the mountains visible in the distance, lights strung along the barracks that glowed in the desert darkness. There was a special meal: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie. A feast that made the regular abundant meals look sparse by comparison. Colonel Harrison visited each barracks personally, wishing prisoners a Merry Christmas through translators, handing out small gifts donated by churches and community groups. Soap, handkerchiefs, candy, books. Tokens that had been wrapped carefully by American civilians who would never meet the prisoners they were giving to, who did it simply because it was Christmas, and that's what you did at Christmas. You gave gifts, even to enemies. Keiko received a bar of lavender soap and a handkerchief embroidered with flowers. There was a note tucked inside, written in careful English. "From the Ladies' Auxiliary of Albuquerque Methodist Church. May you find peace. God bless you." She stared at the note until the words blurred. American women, probably mothers, probably women who had sons or husbands fighting in the Pacific, had made these gifts for Japanese prisoners, had chosen compassion over hatred, had decided that even enemies deserved small kindnesses at Christmas. The generosity was unbearable. That night, Keiko found Sergeant Takahashi outside the barracks, smoking a cigarette and looking at the stars. The translator had become something like a friend over the months, a bridge between worlds, someone who understood the weight of being caught between cultures. "I don't know how to be this person," Keiko said without preamble. "I don't know how to be someone who surrendered, who ate hamburgers, who accepted Christmas gifts from the enemy. I don't know how to go home as this person." Takahashi took a long drag on her cigarette, exhaled slowly. "You think you're going home?" The question hung in the cold desert air. Keiko hadn't let herself think beyond the present, beyond the rhythm of camp life. But eventually, the war would end. Eventually, there would be repatriation, return, home. Wouldn't there? The war can't last forever, Keiko said. No, but the consequences will. Takahashi flicked ash from her cigarette. When you go back, if you go back, you'll be marked. Surrendered prisoner. That's a stain in Japanese culture, right? Worse for women. You'll be suspect, tainted, broken. People will wonder what the Americans did to you. They'll assume the worst. They'll treat you accordingly. You're saying I can never go home. I'm saying a home might not exist anymore. Not the way you remember it. Not for you. Takahashi paused. I can't go home either. I'm American, born in California, but after the internment camps, after being used as a translator while my father died in Manzanar, I don't know what home means anymore. Maybe home is something we carry inside us. Maybe it's something we have to build from scratch. I don't know. They stood in silence, two women made homeless by war, watching the stars that looked the same over Japan and America and everywhere else, indifferent to human suffering, to borders, to the lies that nations told themselves. Part 6. The News That Changed Everything. August 1945 arrived with rumors that swirled through the camp like dust devils. Something big had happened. Something unprecedented. The guards were tight-lipped, nervous. Colonel Harrison called an assembly. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, hundreds of them, Japanese soldiers, sailors, a handful of civilians who'd been caught in war zones. The 8 nurses sat together, a small cluster of women in a sea of men, all of them tense with anticipation. Harrison stood at the front with Sergeant Takahashi beside him. His face was grave, aged. Whatever he was about to say had cost him something to learn. On August 6th, he began, pausing for Takahashi to translate. The United States dropped a new weapon on the city of Hiroshima. It's called an atomic bomb. It's unlike anything that has existed before. One bomb destroyed the entire city. Casualties are estimated between 70,000 and 100,000 people. Most died instantly. The silence in the mess hall was absolute. Not breathing, not moving, not existing. Just the words hanging in the air like fallout. 3 days later, Harrison continued, his voice flat, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, similar casualties, and today, August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war is over. The world ended. Not with an explosion, though there had been explosions that ended cities, ended lives, ended the concept of what war could be. But for the prisoners in that mess hall, the world ended with the translation of those words. Unconditional surrender. Japan didn't surrender. Japan couldn't surrender. The emperor was divine. The nation was eternal. Death before dishonor was the code, the law, the only acceptable outcome. Except the emperor himself had spoken, had announced surrender, had chosen national survival over divine pride. If the emperor could surrender, what was sacred? If the nation could admit defeat, what was eternal? If living mattered more than dying with honor, what had all the dead died for? Men wept openly. Some screamed. One man, a former officer, stood up and began reciting the imperial rescript, the oath of loyalty to the emperor, as if words could unmake reality. Guards moved toward him, ready to restrain, but Colonel Harrison held up a hand. Let him speak, Harrison said quietly. He's earned the right to grieve. Among the nurses, Reiko had gone completely still, her young face blank with shock. Sachiko was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. Michiko stood up and walked out of the mess hall, her movements mechanical, and no one tried to stop her. Keiko felt nothing. The numbness that had been growing in her since the hamburger moment, since the Christmas gifts, since every act of American kindness that undermined everything she'd believed, finally consumed her completely. She was hollow, empty, a shell shaped like a woman with nothing inside.